And for more on the divisive political climate, we are now joined by Aliza Astrow. She is senior political analyst at an organization called Third Way. It is a national think tank that champions modern center-left ideas. Welcome to the conversation. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
We have to begin with the news of the day in this week, and that is the announcement, the surprise announcement in Arizona that Senator Sinema is moving from Democrat to independent. What does that tell you about the state of our politics, and what is the significance of this for the U.S. Senate?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we don't know exactly how it's going to play out with Sinema, exactly how it's going to play out in the Senate. And I think, there are other independent senators, there's Angus King, there's Bernie Sanders. So we don't know exactly how that's going to work out in this particular instance. I recently wrote this report that I'm sure we're going to discuss about third-party candidates at the presidential level and independent candidates at the presidential level, which Third Way, we think that would be really damaging to the Democratic Party and would end up pulling a lot of support away from the Democratic Party. So that's a major concern. How it plays out with Sinema in the Senate is unclear so far.
So let's talk about the poll and the polling itself. What was the methodology and what's the headline in all of this? You indicated that it would help Donald Trump or the Republicans, hurt the Democrats.
Yeah, so we looked at a couple different, we looked at this question a couple different ways. One way that we looked at it was looking at historical precedent and how third-party candidates have performed historically. So we found that in a number of different elections, there was a lot of excitement around third-party candidates. And there was a sense that maybe this was the year that third-party candidates were going to, could win the election or could perform really well. But we found that consistently they underperformed their polling peaks. And so third-party candidates haven't won enough electoral votes in the last 100 years to win a single election. So that was the first thing that we looked at, just looking at this question historically. And we also looked at sort of the strength of the commitment of Republican supporters and specifically Donald Trump supporters as compared to Democrat supporters. So we found that, Trump supporters, when you ask, okay, do you view Trump favorably or not favorably? So among those who view Trump favorably, a vast majority of them view him very favorably, while among those who view Joe Biden favorably, most or about half view him somewhat favorably. So we saw that as really sort of a red flag in terms of the intensity of the support towards Trump versus the support towards Biden, thinking that a third-party candidate could really weaken Biden in a way that it wouldn't weaken Trump.
If you look at the political makeup of the country, and this is a generalization, but it's basically a third Republican, a third Democrat, and a growing third that is much more independent. So what does this tell you about the state of the political parties and how the electorate views Democrats and Republicans?
Yeah, so that's an important data point, that a plurality of American voters view themselves as independent. An important caveat to that, though, is that if you ask people which way they lean, if someone says they're independent, then you can ask them, okay, but do you lean more towards Democrats or towards Republicans? Most independents actually lean towards one party or the other. So it's only actually about 9% of American voters who are really not leaning towards one party or the other at all. So I think that that's an important caveat to the point that, so many American voters are independents. But it does indicate that definitely a lot of American voters feel unrepresented by our current political system and feel frustrated with our parties. And so I think that indicates that there's a lot of opportunity for electoral reform to make people feel that they're more represented by their political system and by the political parties.
But if you look at the recently passed same-sex marriage bill, or you look at other pieces of legislation, the Electoral Count Act that appears to have bipartisan support, are there green shoots of legislation that both sides can come together with?
Yeah, I think absolutely. And we've seen that with this Congress. I mean, Joe Biden came into office saying that he was going to govern on a bipartisan basis and reach across the aisle with his experience as a senator, that he really knew how to do that. And he's shown a lot of strength on this. I think what he's pursued is pursuing legislation that he knows a vast majority of the American people support, Like now, what is it? Over 70% of Americans support same-sex marriage. The bipartisan gun legislation was incredibly popular. So the infrastructure bill, we did a poll on that and saw really overwhelming support for the provisions in the bipartisan infrastructure bill. As well as in the reconciliation bill, the IRA. So by pursuing legislation that is really overwhelmingly popular, even though Republicans don't necessarily want to work across the aisle, Kevin McCarthy, Mitch McConnell aren't super committed to getting things done. A lot of members on the Republican side realized, these things are really popular and there are a lot of political benefits to them in supporting this legislation. And so Biden and the Democrats have overcome a lot of these hurdles to getting things done on a bipartisan basis by pursuing really popular policies.
Aliza, as you know, leading up to the midterm elections, there were predictions of a red wave, maybe a red tsunami. It seemed to be more like a red trickle. And basically, the midterms put the country exactly where we were before the midterms. The Republicans with a very narrow majority in the House, the Democrats with a very narrow majority in the Senate, the Democrat, Joe Biden, still in the White House. And so my question for you is, what is your takeaway from the midterms? What's the lesson for the parties, for the candidates, and for the American people?
Yeah, so we did a post-election or a pre-election poll at Third Way to ask voters a bunch of questions about how they perceive the two parties, how they perceive the different candidates that are on the that were on the ballot in 2022, and sort of what they're looking for from the next couple of years in politics. And something really interesting that we found was that both parties are perceived as extreme. So if you ask how people perceive the Democratic Party and how they perceive the Republican Party, they rate the parties as similarly, far from the center. But if you ask them how they perceive their specific candidates, like the Senate candidate and the Democratic Senate candidate in their state versus the Republican Senate candidate in their state, people saw the Democratic candidate as much more mainstream and the Republican candidate as much more extreme. And so I think that Democrats did a really good job of running candidates that, could appeal across the aisle. And it ended up that Democrats won independent voters overwhelmingly this cycle. And they actually, in a number of key races, won a significant share of Republican voters as well. A number of crossover voters, couldn't support these very extreme Republican candidates and came to support the Democrat instead. And so I think that what we saw is that, first of all, there's a big difference between the Democratic primary electorate and the Republican primary electorate. While the Republican primary electorate is running further and further to the right and becoming more and more extreme, the Democratic primary electorate is nominating mainstream candidates. And so that's a really important difference. And I think that Democrats are going to continue to see success in the next couple of years if we can keep nominating mainstream candidates and keep trying to appeal across the aisle.
But is it that and also the effect or the after effect of Donald Trump?
I think that's a big part of it. I mean, Trump is still really the center of the Republican Party, even as, Republican elites are trying to move on. Republican voters, are still, he's still the front runner for 2024. And so I think it's absolutely somewhat an effect of Donald Trump that he unleashed, he's pulled the Republican Party to the right, and the Republican voters are still seem to be quite attached to him. So I think that Republican continues to be a drag on the Republican Party, and Democrats are benefiting from it for sure.
So you represent an organization called Third Way. Where do disaffected Democrats and Republicans go, and why is it so difficult for these third parties to really break through?
Yeah, I mean, I think that those who think that we need to get rid of the two-party system and run third-party candidates, I disagree there. I think that it would end up benefiting the Republican Party, which I don't see as, which is a danger to our democracy. The Republican Party has gotten consistently more extreme, and running a candidate who might help Trump or another extreme Republican get elected is just too big of a risk to take. I think that instead, Third Way is really interested in trying to figure out how Democrats can continue and strengthen their appeal to moderate voters, to independent voters, and to pull some disaffected Republican voters across the aisle. And so figuring out how Democrats can continue to be seen as mainstream and appeal to those disaffected voters is the most important thing.
Well, let me conclude with our polarized media, get your perspective on how this might often feed into this political vitriol?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think that there have been some studies showing that, if you make someone who regularly watches Fox News, if you pay them to watch like CNN for a month or something like that, they become less extreme, and they actually they're more aware of different kinds of different issues that are going on, and they're more open to opposing perspectives. And so I think that indicates that this really is a problem, that our extreme media, especially on the right, which I think there's asymmetric polarization there for sure, have driven people in a bad direction. And so I think it's absolutely a big problem.
So turn the channel and be open to perhaps another point of view. Aliza Astrow is a senior political analyst at an organization called Third Way. Thank you for being part of this conversation.
Thanks so much.